Welcome to Skeleton Key Tales. Today's story: The Omen, Part 1. The brilliant Tamalik of Kamum once said that the difference between a people's affliction and blessing is blowing in a desert wind. Chance, or a god's fancy, is as fickle as a dust devil spinning on a dune. One day the wind fills the sails, the other buries great cities under sand. Not a living soul under the sun, save the spiteful and the jealous, would deny that Kamum was a great city. Some, having had the honor of visiting it, swore it was worthy of the gods to stroll its streets, admire its temples, and marvel at its gardens. Alas, there was an affliction in the desert wind, waiting to subvert Kamum's many blessings. One night, a runaway star crossed the dark sky. Its flare was so bright it turned night into day and chased the people of Kamum out of their homes. They all cast their eyes upward to a fiery arch and to the sky aflame. Confusion descended upon the city, as no one could tell what this portent meant. Was it a sign of great favor from Shertesh, the father of stars, or was it his punishment? Even the high diviner froze in disbelief, gripping the blue-glazed parapet on the upper terrace of his temple atop a ziggurat. His chest heaving, he rushed down the stairs. At his command, runners were sent to fetch other diviners. Before sunrise would come, he scrambled to consult the constellations, in an attempt to determine if the fallen star meant Shertesh's grace or ire. For but a moment, there was only stillness and the flame bow above. Birds, insects, and even the wind cowered away. Then the errant star landed. It struck the ground with such vicious force that everyone in Kamum staggered from the tremors sent forth by the stars, and that night no one in the city dared to return home. That night the desert wind changed. In just the blink of an eye, as the tremors died deep beneath the crust of the earth, the streets of Kamum turned into rivers of people carrying hundreds of torches or clutching fluttering lamps. From the high temple terrace, it seemed as though the star's flaming tail, now dim and dispersed, seeped down from the sky into the streets and poured towards the east gate like molten copper. The errant star, a messenger of Shertesh no doubt, didn't fall too far from the city walls. Everyone hurried to see it. Those who could not walk crawled or were carried by the others. Soon enough, the enormous crowd first trampled over the fields and canals, then pushed through the salt flats, then took to the desert sands, recklessly climbing dunes knee-deep in its gilded drifts. As the first, the toughest and the swiftest, reached the top of the last dune separating them from the place where the star came down, a pale shine had already touched the horizon. It was dawn, a golden blaze over the golden dunes, and in this glorious radiance people gazed down upon a crater in the sand the size of a city quarter. In its center below lay a dark sphere, still pulsating with otherworldly heat, veiled in haze. The wind, now brazenly strong, picked up the peppery scent of melted sand and the foreign odor of the cooling sphere, to which no word yet existed. Some asserted it smelled of polished ivory. Others objected that it smelled like burned clay. People gathered along the rim of the crater like a living palisade, voices hanging in sweltering air, arms ringing. It wasn't long until the first man dropped to his knees and, digging his fingers into the sand, began to pray. Seeing the man contort on the ground and praise Shertesh was, to the crowd, like a taskmaster's command. They knew not the nature and the effect of the omen. They were struck equally by awe and dread, looking down at the guest from beyond. The high diviner had given them no guidance, no relief of a wise interpretation, no answer ritual. The other priests were searching for answers inside their temples. With them preoccupied back within Kamum's limits, the crowd appeared to be a sheep without its shepherd. People looked around them in hesitance, timid eyes glancing left and right at others, only to meet the same uncertain look. Should they pray in gratitude? Should they ask Sheetesh to forgive them their transgressions? But the pressure of the presence of the divine was insurmountable for many. Another man dropped, tears flowing down his gaunt cheeks. A woman began to wail in a raving plea. It started a cascade of bending bodies. Many resolved to chant just the name of the Father of Stars, be it in penance or praise. But there were forces stronger than even the mightiest of gods or fear of divine punishment. Hunger and thirst soon came to claim their due, and people began trickling back through the salt flats and irrigated fields to their bread and their beer. It was as though a new river braved its course from the city to the fallen star and back. Work was for a while forgotten. People came home to save their bodies and hurried back to look upon the messenger of Sheetesh, succeeded on their pilgrim's path by countless others. For the High Diviner, the night had been spent in a frenzied search for answers that were never there. When the falling star split the sky, he swept through the temple like a wild Samum. His heart seizing with panic, he hurried down the steps, tripping over his own feet. From the upper terrace, he descended to his chambers. From there down another flight of winding steps, flanked on all sides by the alabaster figures of K'Mum's patron god, Gigerum. Then, through long corridors of blue and white, decorated with the intricate designs of all the lesser gods and illuminated by ever-lit lamps. Pushing open one carved cedar door after another, the High Diviner finally found himself in a hall of omens, the destination of his blistering rush. He wasn't the first to come. The room had already been populated by several priests. If not for the significance of what had occurred, the High Diviner would have been mad with outrage. All the priests were hastily dressed, scrambling over one another like skittering rats, and they reeked of sweat and spoiled food instead of incense and aromatic oils. On any other day, it would have been an offense to the gods who kept a watchful eye on K'Mum, but this night's soaring messenger absolved this infraction. Here, one of the priests clambered toward the High Diviner with a clay tablet clutched in his hands. He was far too distressed to follow the prescribed procedure of addressing the High Diviner. "I think it's this one. It was in the column of affliction." "Give me that." The High Diviner fixed his stare on the tablet. One glance was enough for him to recall which exact shelf produced this Omen tablet in the column of affliction. After all, he knew them all. He could determine the tablet and its meaning by touch alone, so well had he memorized them. This was not the one. The writhing cuneiform text covering the tablet was close in its description of the sign they were given, and yet it wasn't close enough. Back where it belongs, the High Diviner pressed the tablet back into the hands of the confused priest. "Keep looking." Shedding all semblance of subordination, the High Diviner himself approached the wall before him and joined the search. 4 columns sat in front of the wall of the Hall of Omens: ruination, affliction, blessing, and exaltation. After a moment's delay, the High Diviner decided to begin with the ruination tablets. He paused, running his glance up and down the myriad shelves, suffering under the weight of hundreds of tablets, describing omens recorded from the first laid stone of K'Mum to this day. He grabbed a sturdy ladder. In the flickering lamplight, if one were to invoke the name of Gigerum, the studded giant, he could almost see him keeping vigil behind the 4 stone columns. There stood a monolithic wall of untamed opulence, a symbol of K'Mum's loyalty to Gigerum, lavishly decorated with sheet gold, lapis inlays, glimmering gemstones, exquisite granulated designs, and scenes of Gigerum's exploits produced entirely from electrum with incrustations of costly imported turquoise. For the Lugul of K'Mum, there was no price in this world he couldn't match in silver. If it was in Gigerum's name, there was no price he wouldn't match. The wall of the Hall of Omens was a work of such unparalleled magnificence that even the High Diviner, who frequented it, couldn't resist the temptation of a moment of silent admiration. Today, however, the opulence dimmed, and the sullen stone of the columns came to the fore. One shelf after another, one step on the ladder at a time, the priests climbed the columns like a vine hugging a tree trunk. Stars paled and the sky turned grey in anticipation of the morning, and even the hum of the undulating crowd outside subsided. But there was no end to their strenuous work. Whenever a tablet was discovered describing an omen of some similarity, the High Diviner was presented with it, and he promptly dismissed it. He grew ever more agitated. There was no tablet about such an omen in the Hall of Omens. If it wasn't here, then it was a new omen, never before witnessed, and its meaning mockingly eluded the High Diviner. Placing yet another tablet back on its shelf with a deep sigh, he descended his ladder and sank to the floor, his back against the lavishness of the wall of Gigerum. He buried his face in his hands. His head pulsed with a dull ache. His bloodshot eyes stared at the side of the weakest lamp. The Lugu had, no doubt, already sent his men to inquire about the meaning of the sign. To come to them empty-handed was like walking out the ziggurat's entrance with your own head in a bowl for an offering. Reeling from nausea, the High Diviner sprang back to his feet. Under the concerned stares of the lesser priests, he rushed out of the hall. As his figure shrank into the twilight of the temple, the echoing jingle of golden trinkets on his extravagant robe surged and scattered against the ceiling. One more passageway and a pivot right. He forced open the gates of the grand chamber and swiftly crossed it, blasphemously, without as much as a glance upon the great statue of Gigerum supporting the ceiling with his mountain-splitting palms. The precious eyes of the studded giant, fashioned from two pieces of serpentine the size of a man's head, watched the High Diviner disappear behind a low, modest door leading to a dark corridor opening into the Hall of Stars. The room welcomed him with solemn silence, the sort of quiet that is frequent in ancient places, rumored to be the dwelling grounds of gods whose names are long since lost to the wind. Indeed, in this place, in the most opulent and revered temple in all of Kamum, the universe itself dwelt, albeit shrunk to fit into a hall. No matter the urgency, the High Diviner couldn't resist lifting his eyes up to the ceiling. In the half-light of the Hall of Stars, so fervently maintained by its stewards with a clever arrangement of lamps and special wicks, he saw the glimmer of heavenly blue and divine gold overhead. There, spanning the entire breadth of the hall, was the map of the starry sky and its most prominent constellations, charted with thin wires of electrum and gold. The stars themselves, carved from lapis lazuli with radiant veins of pyrite, were capable of mesmerizing any eye laid upon them, no matter how used it was to luxury. The stewards of the hall were naturally sleepless. After all, they had become, through years of pious observation, nocturnal creatures. The temple's master stargazer and his subordinates emerged from the coiling shadows of the hall, echoes of their shuffling feet rippling through, and met the High Diviner in its center. They were perhaps the only temple dwellers who had not yet lost their minds to royal panic. In perfect ceremony, they bowed before their spiritual leader and exchanged greetings in strict accordance with procedure. But then, with the greeting ceremony over, the Master Stargazer didn't waste any more time on pleasantries. "We saw it. I know why you're here. And the answer is no." He began with a shake of his hooded head. The stars were in perfect natural order. There was nothing unusual about the constellations and the places they took on the night's dome. If there is a sign or a threat or a warning or any other intention, I am certain that it's not hidden in the movement of constellations. The High Diviner could do little more, and he had even less to say. With a despondent nod, he threw a farewell glance at the exquisite ceiling cosmos. The lapis stars were cold to the eye's touch and offered no answer, just like the sky they were shaped after. The High Diviner had no choice but to retreat back to his chambers under the upper terrace and resign until dawn for contemplation. On the way, he made sure the temple's exorcists were hard at work, preparing an answer ritual for this mysterious omen. The intoxicating scent of incense had already penetrated the many corridors and passages of the temple. The High Diviner paused at the threshold of his chambers, staring at the chaos he had caused when he crashed through. An overturned chair here, a nudged table there, a shard of a broken pot on a stone floor draped in carpets, and scattered tablets littering the room in utter disarray. With a sigh of resignation, the High Diviner approached one of the chairs, flipped it back to its legs, and dropped onto it. He placed his head to rest on his two clenched fists and shut his eyes. The weight of his thoughts felt almost palpable, even smothering. From a pool of swirling questions, he tried to spearfish at least something, a hint, applying his mind in this or that direction. The star of Sheertesh, splitting the night sky with its blazing tail before boring into the sand with a violent impact, was not among the many omens immortalized on the Omen tablets. Neither did the constellations shift, as the Master Stargazer had assured, heralding a change of cosmic forces. But the most puzzling circumstance was not the fallen star, but the one who stirred it into flight. Sheertesh was not the god the High Diviner expected to communicate with the clergy and laymen of Kumum. After all, he was the patron god of the distant Ahrit, a city far to the south, and he had plenty of mortal flock to occupy his time with. The temples of Ahrit, as the High Diviner had heard, were not of such grandeur as Kumum's, yet they were respectable, and Sheertesh had been content with the praise he received. The High Diviner opened his eyes again. This painful deliberation led him to a simple truth. The fallen star, then, was meant to be a message. Sheertesh didn't want praise, nor did he wish to boast of his might to intimidate Gigarum or his grand city. He wanted to say something, in the language gods wielded, unrestrained by the confines of the human tongue. As this conclusion bloomed inside the High Diviner, he hurried back to his feet. He had to see the star, and examine the sky above it and the sand below it. He resolved to do so at once, even if that meant elbowing his way through the crowd from the east gate to the desert. It took the High Diviner almost half a day to assemble his assistants, fetch a scribe, and gather a small outfit of guards. When he finally arrived at the edge of the desert, where the wind tugged at the blanket of sands covering the border of the salt flats, the sun had already prepared to set. The crowd's frenzied fervor in the presence of a divine messenger had been relentless, and the pulse of the people back to Kumum and out to the dunes remained ceaseless, promising to keep its tide and ebb into the night. It took more than a few barking orders from the guards to force the wall of people to come apart. Hissing warnings and weighing their cudgels with intent, they had to advance step by step, as though it were a pitched battle. The High Diviner shifted from foot to foot with impatience. Wherever their party went, they were met with a low, discontented drone from the crowd. Priest of priests though he might be, his authority waned before the messenger of a god. Make way for the High Diviner! The guards' voices had grown coarse before the High Diviner could even reach the east gate. Now, at the fold of the crater, their commands came out with a wheeze, easily smothered by the noise around them. However, there were people in the crush who recognized the figure in the center of the party that struggled to reach the fallen star, and they fell to their knees in respect. Soon enough, the mood changed from displeasure to cheerful expectation. There was a whisper traveling from one row of pilgrims to another. The High Diviner had finally arrived to deliver a word to the masses. From that moment on, the living walls led the party through without any need for threats. After a moment's delay, the High Diviner finally gazed upon the bearer of the word from Sheertesh. In just a single day of ecstatic praise, the fallen star had been transformed into a temple under the open sky. The name of Sheertesh was on every parched lip. The gravity of people's admiration had kept visitors away from the darkened sphere through the morning and most of the day. But as the haze around the star waned into the desert wind, and as it slowly cooled down, and as divine punishment failed to descend upon those brave enough to sit at the very rim of the crater, the same admiration pulled untold masses down the slopes. Now, at sunset, the sand had been tamped by hundreds of feet, both shod and bare. The sphere itself, somber and barren earlier, was now flaunting a garment of billowing ribbons, jangling trinkets, and faience and alabaster beads littering the ground around it. It looked so festive that it seemed as though the desert were about to host a wedding for Kamum with the fallen star as bride. The High Diviner arched his brows. He struggled to swallow a sudden knot in his throat. Furtively he looked around him. A step behind, his proud escort stood watch, guards with their cudgels, their eyes either closed or respectfully down, and the assistants, whose faces grew pale and frightened as they realized why their patron was so alarmed at the star's celebratory dress. Only the scribe seemed as fascinated as the commoners. The High Diviner's eyes darted along the fence of people surrounding the crater. He was looking for something right beneath their feet, or rather between them. To his dismay, his trained eye soon noticed what he expected to see. There were dark, swift shapes skittering to and fro, slipping between people's ankles unseen and almost always unnoticed. Only rarely did one throw a cursory glance at his feet, having felt a breath of moving air, catching nothing but sand under his soles. "Guards!" The High Diviner turned his wrist, catching his escort's attention. "We must bar people's entry to the star. You," he singled one guard out, "run to Kamum and request a large regiment of watchmen. We have to force all these people out of the desert and quickly." The scribe approached, a clay tablet and a stylus readied. The High Diviner's decision confused him greatly. He kept looking over his shoulder, diligent in his attempts to follow the High Diviner's stare, but fruitlessly. "Master, an order like this is sure to cause discontent. There are so many people here." He gave the crowd a fearful, appraising look. "I trust your wisdom, but why?" But the High Diviner was in no hurry to share his vision. First he beckoned his assistants. "Remove all of this." His fingers circled vaguely over the mountain of offerings and adornments bestowed upon the sphere. "Show disregard, then bury it all in the sand." The High Diviner then turned back and spoke to his scribe, but his eyes peered over his head, aiming at the crater's rim. "The Urgaloops are on the prowl," he finally replied, certain that the scribe would understand. "We have angered the Master of the Desert greatly, praising his rival among his dunes and his domain, and he has sent his minions. We ought to hurry, lest the sands part and swallow all these poor men and women. Or worse. Look, but be slow. There's another Urgaloop perched atop the star." The scribe was of a layman's lot, and not well versed in consorting with spirits or the divine. As he timidly raised his eyes, he could indeed make something out on top of the sphere, something he couldn't immediately describe or comprehend. To an untrained eye, it was as though a patch of reality had been torn off. It was a dark spot of indistinct color, a blemish in the fabric of what could be perceived by the naked eye. The scribe strained his eyes to discern the shape of the creature. For the first few moments he couldn't focus on it. The edges of its lines danced and shifted, rejecting the stare, such that the scribe had to concentrate just to keep his eyes straight. But then, all of a sudden, he finally realized what he was looking at. His eyes widened as he struggled to keep back an exclamation. The Urgaloop was an enormous camel spider, the size of a large cat, sitting motionlessly on top of the fallen star. To see one in the desert was an ill sign. It meant that the Lord of the Sands was watching, and your presence offended him. The Urgaloop was armed with a large scorpion's tail, and the scribe even fancied he saw a drop of venom dangling from the dreadful-looking sting. Unlike the rest of its unmoving body, the tail of the Urgaloop tilted left and right in a hypnotic sway. For a single breath, the bulging eyes of the Urgaloop peered deep into the scribe's being. He felt a sensation for which words had not yet been invented, scorching heat pulsing through toward each limb, unraveling pace by pace into a grave chill. It was as if the scribe were unmade into a sheet of skin, flesh, and flattened bone, scrutinized and then restored, all in a blink of an eye. The scribe was certain now that the Urgaloop realized it was being watched. Without a sound, it vanished. The reality around it collapsed back whole. Having recoiled from this sudden sensation, the scribe swept cold beads of sweat from his brow. So this is what it feels like to be noticed by a god, the scribe thought to himself. This was the first and only thought that emerged amid the emptiness the gaze of an Urgaloop left inside him. He savored this thought, realizing that he, a mere gnat, had stood under the eye of Urgul the Hidden, if only for a sliver of time. All the while, the High Diviner was busy ordering his assistants around as they dismantled the colorful display. After the deed was done and the best of the adornments assembled and respectfully buried under the sparkling sand, he said something to one of the exorcists in training. The assistant then thrust his hand into a small sack and produced a clay tablet wrapped in linen and recently covered with shapes and cuneiform. The tablet, in a hasty and haphazard manner, depicted the star's flame bow as it had appeared in the sky. The High Diviner accepted it and studied it for a while. He could trust the depiction no more than the eyes of the one who drew it, which meant he couldn't trust it at all. He was, however, short of options. Solemnly he raised his eyes to the fading sunset. Not much of it remained above the peaks of the mountains, bleeding purple and crimson as if from a gaping wound in the sky. The stars, although pale shadows of themselves yet, gained prominence by the moment. Entangled in his own troubled thoughts, the High Diviner noticed the choir of disgruntled voices rising behind him. The gods had set out to exact his command, perhaps a bit more zealously than they ought to. First offended by the savaging of their new idol, now forced out of the sands that bore it, the people were quick to voice their discontent. Emboldened by their numbers, they took a step toward the gods, only to take 2 steps back, their courage foiled by the cudgels. "The stars are still dim," one of the assistants hummed, looking up at the sky. It was rapidly shedding its grey to dress in dark blue. "I suppose we're going to be waiting here until they're bright and telling. Thankfully the night's cloudless," another replied as he lowered himself onto the sand and crossed his legs. The High Diviner did the same, and seeing him sit down in patience, the rest of his retinue followed suit. Soon, the place where the errant star had found its rest grew almost silent, with only the whisper of the wind and the stir of sands breaking that silence. The gods stood steadfast, motionless like idols themselves. Their stares were cast along the lines of the dunes. The clergy, by contrast, watched the dome of the world, waiting for the children of Sher-Tesh to reveal themselves. The stars soon shared their light, and the sky dome transformed into a studded canopy, as though touched by the generous hand of Gigerum. The night was indeed clear. Under the gleam of the moon, Urgul retreated to his catacombs, and the heat went with him. Armed now with a piercing chill, the untiring wind forced those few who remained to tug and pull at their robes and tunics. But the High Diviner, it seemed, cared little for the frigid desert night. His skin crawling with goosebumps, he sat transfixed, peering at the heavenly bodies floating overhead. However, when he resolved that the sky was in position, he burst into motion all at once. First, he rubbed his shoulders and listened to the clatter of his teeth. With a shaking hand, he reached for the tablet. "A light!" he said. Covering the feeble flame of a lamp cupped in his hand, one of the assistants joined him. The light leaned against the tablet. For a moment, the depicted arch soaked in the glow, as though set ablaze, even in clay. The High Diviner narrowed his eyes. He was comparing meticulously, star by star, line by line. He had an idea, or rather, in fairness, only a suspicion. He yearned to know what constellations and clusters lay behind that flaming bow that had cracked the sky. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the story. Consider subscribing to my channel. You can also find the full text on my Substack. The link is in the description. Until next time.